Morning, class. Welcome to another video on cells again. This is going to be in place of the live class since no one showed up today, so I'm going to have to just continue on with these videos and just report to the yearhead that no one's showing up. We'll go from there. But since no one showed up, I still have to give you guys some information and some work for today, and this is going to be that. And today was really going to be more of a revision on cells, and then moving on to something called cell specialization. There was a bit of confusion on Monday about what cell specialization and stem cells and differentiation, what all those words meant. And so today I'm going to be explaining that a bit more. If you had your learning objectives for today, it would be revision of cells, of their functions, and some of their organelles, and then also cell specialization, understanding what that means and how we can apply it in our normal everyday lives. But the first thing I want to do is revision of cell theory. So you notice that these are all in red. What you guys are going to need to do for today's work, as a part of today's work, is having everything that is red in these next few slides. Not everything's in red. Notice in the next slide these are in white. Notice so that anything in red, that's going to be taken down in your copy. So there's going to be quite a bit of that today. If you guys showed up today, there wouldn't be as much work. But now that you have all the time in the world, since you're not in a live class, you're just sitting at home, you guys can do this. So anything in red, make sure it's taken down in your copies. So this is cell theory again. This is from early last week, just describing what a cell is and how to know if something's alive, right? So cell theory says that all organisms are composed of cells. Organisms are just living things. That's another word for living things, right? So anything from the tree outside your window to yourself, to your dog, to your cat, all of those things are living things. They don't have to be animals, and they don't even have to be plants. They can be something called bacteria, which we'll talk about at some point. Little single cellular things. They all are made up of cells, though. So that is one truth about organisms, okay? Next one, the cell is a structural unit of life. Units smaller than cells are not alive. So this is saying that anything that makes up a cell, so if we're talking about, like we've been saying, our organelles, the mitochondria, the nucleus, whatever it is in there, those are not technically alive because they're smaller than a single cell. So if your cell is a single unit, anything smaller than that cell is not alive. And then this last one here, cells arise by division of pre-existing cells, meaning that spontaneous generation does not exist. So if you remember way back, we had a question about what does not exist in cell theory. Spontaneous generation, which means that you don't just have cells popping up out of nowhere from nothing, right? They have to come from somewhere. All of our body cells come from previous existing cells, cells that were already there. Okay? It can't come from nowhere. Even when you're being born and you have a baby growing, those cells came from your mother and your father, right? They didn't just pop up from nowhere. You had to get the sperm cell and the egg cell. That didn't just come from nowhere. So cells arise by division of pre-existing cells. Okay? Spontaneous generation does not exist. Moving on. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. This is just for your work afterwards. So name that organelle, where DNA is located, where energy is released, what keeps things in and out of the cell, what maintains the structure of a plant cell, and what makes proteins in the cell. These are all different organelles that you guys should know. If you don't, go back into this, into the videos that I've given you, or in the PowerPoint that I'm going to post. You'll find the answers all in there. Put that in your copy for today's work. Again, this was more for the live class. What I needed you guys to do is to name this organelle. So quickly, if you want to pause the video, test yourself. What is the organelle here that I've blacked out in green in this big blue blob? This is a plant cell, and we know that because there's a chloroplast, there's a cell wall. Those two don't exist in animal cells, so we know it's a plant cell. So what do you think this is? Pause the video real quick. And it is a vacuole. Specifically, it's a central vacuole, but it is a vacuole. Remember that vacuoles kind of store the plant's food and water, okay? So, specifically today, I wanted to talk about cell specialization. And cell specialization is, sorry, I just need to edit something real quick. Too loud, am I? There we go. It's a bit better. So cell specialization is when you have a stem cell, which is cells that are found, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, cells that can be either found in your bone marrow or in the umbilical cord of a baby. These are the really early cells. Like I said, cells have to come from somewhere, right? They can't just come out of nowhere. So we kind of start off with stem cells, and then that stem cell goes through something called differentiation, which is what that video was talking about yesterday. Differentiation means that all it means is this stem cell is going through some kind of change and it's giving itself a job. So it might become a muscle cell, it might become a bone cell, it might become a nervous cell, it might become a sex cell. It can become any of these things. And that process is called differentiation. Okay? So, specifically though, stem cells are undifferentiated cells. So they're cells that haven't been given a job yet. Undifferentiated cells. That can even be a key word for today. Notice this is all in red. Make sure this is taken down in your copy. They can be found in either the adult bone marrow or embryonic umbilical cord. So if you're an adult, all your stem cells are going to be found in the bone marrow because you don't have an umbilical cord anymore. Okay? So that's where you can find them, and that's what they are. They're undifferentiated cells. They haven't been given a specific purpose yet. So once that cell gets differentiated, it can become any number of things. Like I said, it can become nerve cell, blood cell, bone cell, any of these things. And once you get enough of those cells, so once enough stem cells have become nerve cells, you create something called nerve tissue. Tissue is just a grouping of cells that have a similar purpose, right? So if you have a bunch of bones, or let's say muscle cells, it becomes a muscle tissue. And once you have enough muscle tissue, you can create the organs. So you create your bicep or your quadriceps. But if you're talking about nerve cells and you get enough nerve tissue, you create the brain and the spinal cord. These are all organs in the nerve, in something we call the nerve system. Then once you get enough organs, you create a system, right? So you have your nervous system. So you have your organ, your brain, working together with your spinal cord, working together with all your other nerves, creating a massive system, right? And all of those cells in that system, in those organs, in those tissues, working our way back down, have all been differentiated into nerve cells. Okay? Okay. So at the top here, notice this is in red. Differentiated cells equals cells that have been given a purpose. So these have been, they've gone from stem cells. Now they're any number of cells. So I have 4 specific examples here. These blood cells came from stem cells, but they were differentiated and given a purpose. So they all look a little different, right? So once a stem cell becomes differentiated, it can turn into any of the following and more. They are also called somatic cells. So just another word for cells that have been differentiated is called somatic cells. So we have blood cells. And what's going to happen though is all these cells are going to look a little different because they have different jobs, right? Someone who is working on a construction site probably has different tools and looks a little different from a doctor or a teacher. All these people are given different jobs. All these cells are given different jobs. Therefore, they all look a little different, might have different tools to do their jobs correctly. So specifically, when you get a blood cell, there's no nucleus, which makes room for oxygen, because what blood does is it carries oxygen around your body. So instead of looking like a normal cell that we kind of looked at a while ago, it wouldn't have a nucleus. Nerve cells, kind of what looks like back here, they look very different from what you might think a normal cell looks like. They kind of stretch out like this, right? And they have this long tendril kind of coming out of it. So what happens, nerve cells, they have a lot of nerves to move electrical pulses. So all up in this long tendril here, there's a bunch of nerves that move electrical pulses. Normal cells wouldn't have that, right? So nerve cells have been differentiated to the point where they can do this job correctly. Muscle cells, they have a lot of mitochondria to create power. Your muscles have to move heavy things. They have to lift things. They have to push things. They have to pull things, right? That's what's keeping your body kind of upright, kind of to a certain extent. So muscle cells specifically, they have a lot of different functions and tools, but what I'm going to focus on here is they have a lot of mitochondria to create power. And then sperm cells, I'll show you guys pictures here on the next slide, sperm cells have a long tail, which is also called a flagella, to move to the egg cell, right? Because it starts at one point and it has to move through and try and find the egg cell. So it's been differentiated and it's been given a long tail. And also in that tail, there's lots of mitochondria. Normal cells don't have that, right? Okay, so if we look at this slide, take a second, pause it. What I want you guys to try and do is to try and name each of these cells. Some of them I've already given to you, okay? But try and pause it based off of what the information is on this slide. It's one of these four. These four are either the blood, nerve, muscle, or sperm cell. So what I need you guys to do is pause the video and try and label each one of these cells, okay? So pause. Okay, so starting up here on the upper left-hand corner, this is exactly like this one way back here, so it's obviously going to be a nerve cell, right? It's got this long tendril coming out of it, and it's sending electrical pulses, okay? This one's pretty easy. This big red one here, you've probably seen it loads of times before. This is the red blood cell. Notice it has this little dimple on the inside of it. There's no nucleus in there. It's just creating more room for oxygen to be there. This one, kind of like I was talking about on the previous slide, it has a long tail. This is called the flagella right here. This is a sperm cell. And this last one here is actually a big grouping of them. But notice there's lots of mitochondria all around here, okay? And anytime you see myo, M-Y-O, you can probably know that it is a muscle cell, okay? Okay, make sure you have all those labeled. Okay, why do we need to know all this? The reason that we need to know about cells, about stem cells, about differentiation, is because it helps us to know how the body works, right? And knowing how cells work also helps medicine work. If you are taking paracetamol, you need to know how that paracetamol is going to affect the cells in your body. If we didn't, you wouldn't be able to target the pain that it's trying to get rid of, right? But it also lets us know what we need to be eating, right? If we understand how cells work, how they create energy, how they store energy, because what happens if you eat too much unhealthy food, you gain weight and you put on fat. Fat is what happens when cells aren't able to use up everything they're eating, right? And they just store it, okay? So if we understand how cells work, we can, we need to understand it for medicine, we need to understand for our own health. So even if you aren't interested in being a doctor, you still need to understand this when it comes to treating your body right, okay? But also knowing about cells helps us lead to stem cells and understanding how that works, because stem cells are incredibly important when it comes to our own health and possibly advances in the medical field, right? So here's some risks and benefits of stem cells in medicine. So what happens is in doctors, in certain surgeries and stuff, they use stem cells to treat leukemia. Leukemia is a type of cancer, right? So they use something called chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Maybe some of you, hopefully not, but know people that have gone through this. It's a terrible process. But what happens is it stops their bone marrow from producing new white blood cells, and that they do a bone marrow transplant containing stem cells from a matching donor that allows healthy blood cells to be made in the patient. So maybe the bone marrow isn't creating what it's supposed to be doing. So what you can do is you take out that bone marrow and put in new ones. That bone marrow, as we know, because stem cells come from bone marrow, that's the previous slide, that those new stem cells allow you to create better white blood cells, which are what fight off infection and such, okay? So that's just one positive benefit to stem cells, right? But also then the risk, because there's always a risk with some of these things, risk of infection from the environment and the donor, as chemotherapy and radiotherapy leave a patient with no immune system. What happens when a patient goes through chemotherapy or radiotherapy is, like it says, it kills off some of their bone marrow and their white blood cells. Now, while they're waiting for this bone marrow transplant, they don't have anything to fight off infection anymore. So it can really leave them open to infections and diseases, okay? So what I need you guys to do, 3 things. First things first is you might have this done already. Make sure you have everything taken down that was in red, okay? That should all be in your copy, because I don't want there to be huge gaps in our copies when we get back to school. Number 2, answer questions on slide 56. So that would be, I'm going to go way back here. That would be these questions here. Okay, so if you want to pause it, go ahead and answer these questions if you haven't already. Okay? Or, yeah. So, and that's number 2. The last thing I need you guys to do is research 2 more benefits and 2 more risks for the use of stem cells. So this is on your own devices, in your copy, or wherever you are turning work in. Write down 2 more benefits and 2 more risks for stem cells, like I have here. This is 1 and 1, so you need 2 more. Don't use these ones. There's loads of them out there. It's incredibly interesting, I think, because stem cells are a very new field, and it's a very it could be a really important tool we use in the future when it comes to our own medicine, our own health. But like I said, there are risks that come with it. So that's your work for today, okay? All right. Thank you so much, guys, and I will talk to you soon.